Why the strongest positions feel uncontested. There's a point at which power becomes so embedded, so normalized, and so deeply woven into everyday systems that it no longer attracts opposition, no longer provokes challenge, and no longer feels like something that can even be contested. At that stage, power does not appear dominant. It appears inevitable. Most people imagine strength as something that invites resistance, something visible, something obvious enough to push against. But the strongest positions in the modern world are defined by the absence of conflict, because nothing about them feels urgent, offensive, or worth fighting directly. To understand why this matters now, we need to examine how opposition actually forms. Resistance requires clarity. It needs a target. It needs a sense that pressure can produce change. When those elements disappear, resistance collapses before it begins. The sheiks observed this pattern repeatedly. They watched how power that announced itself loudly created enemies quickly, how dominance that demanded recognition organized coalitions against it, and how authority that explained itself invited negotiation. So they pursued a different trajectory. Instead of becoming stronger publicly, they became unavoidable structurally. Instead of enforcing outcomes, they embedded defaults. Instead of defending position, they normalized it. This is how uncontested power is built. When a position feels natural, people stop imagining alternatives. When outcomes repeat consistently, they stop questioning origin. And when systems deliver stability, they become reference points rather than targets. At this stage, opposition does not disappear because it is defeated. It disappears because it feels impractical. Fighting the system would mean fighting normality itself. The sheiks understood that the most powerful advantage is not winning arguments, but preventing them from forming. This is why the strongest positions feel calm. They are rarely defended, rarely explained, rarely emphasized. They simply exist, and that existence reshapes behavior quietly. People adapt. They align. They optimize within boundaries they no longer see. This is the opening truth. Power becomes uncontested, not when it overwhelms opposition, but when it dissolves the conditions required for opposition to organize at all. But this state is not permanent by default. Uncontested power is stable only as long as outcomes remain tolerable, as long as disruption stays localized, as long as alternatives remain theoretical. The moment reality shifts, even the strongest positions can be tested. What happens when uncontested power finally encounters friction reveals whether inevitability was real or merely assumed. Uncontested power begins revealing its true mechanics when friction appears but fails to generate resistance, because the system has already conditioned participants to adapt rather than confront, to adjust rather than oppose, and to search for accommodation instead of alternatives. At this stage, challenges do not arrive as revolts. They arrive as complaints, as inefficiencies, as requests for adjustment. This is not accidental. The sheiks understood that when power becomes embedded deeply enough, dissatisfaction loses its edge. People do not demand change. They ask for optimization. Instead of questioning the structure, they try to improve their position within it. Instead of challenging authority, they look for shortcuts, exemptions, or workarounds. This behavior signals something critical. Opposition has been psychologically neutralized. Friction is no longer interpreted as injustice. It is interpreted as inconvenience. And inconvenience does not mobilize movements. The system absorbs these signals quietly. Minor adjustments are made. Small concessions are granted. Nothing structural shifts. This creates a powerful illusion. People feel heard. They feel accommodated. But the core position remains untouched. Uncontested power thrives on this dynamic. By allowing surface-level responsiveness, it prevents deep questioning. By solving small problems, it avoids large ones. The sheiks refine this approach carefully. They learn that responsiveness does not weaken power, as long as it never threatens the underlying framework. In fact, selective responsiveness strengthens legitimacy. When people see minor changes, they assume major change is possible, and that assumption keeps them engaged without ever becoming oppositional. This is how power stays uncontested, even when it is imperfect. However, this balance is delicate. Too much accommodation invites expectation. Too little invites frustration, and frustration, if it accumulates, can reignite resistance. The strongest positions therefore monitor friction constantly, not to eliminate it, but to keep it below the threshold, where it transforms into defiance. This is the quiet discipline of uncontested power. It does not eliminate conflict. It manages it. And as long as conflict remains manageable, authority remains unquestioned. But thresholds exist. When friction stops being individual and starts becoming shared, when inconvenience becomes collective, and when adaptation feels exhausting rather than practical, even uncontested power can begin to crack. That is when the next phase begins. Because inevitability only holds until people remember that systems were built and can, in theory, be rebuilt. The conflict emerges when friction stops being isolated and begins to synchronize, because the moment individual inconveniences align into shared experience, uncontested power is forced to confront something it has carefully avoided for a long time: collective awareness. At first, this alignment is subtle. People notice the same delays, the same bottlenecks, the same limitations appearing across different spaces. Conversations change tone. What once sounded like personal frustration begins sounding structural. What once felt like bad luck starts feeling patterned. This is dangerous territory, because uncontested power survives on dispersion. It relies on dissatisfaction, remaining fragmented, unconnected, personal. The sheiks understood that once people compare notes, the system itself becomes visible, and visibility is the enemy of inevitability. As awareness spreads, the language shifts. People stop asking how to adapt. They start asking why adaptation is always required. They stop optimizing. They start questioning design. This is the early stage of resistance. Not loud, not organized, but perceptual. The system responds instinctively. Communication increases. Explanations multiply. Reassurance becomes frequent, but explanation is a trap. The more power explains, the more it admits that explanation matters. And the moment explanation matters, permission quietly returns. The sheiks avoided this mistake. Instead of defending inevitability, they reinforced dependency. Systems were integrated more deeply. Alternatives were made less practical. Exit costs increased quietly. This slowed momentum. People noticed friction, but found no clean escape. They questioned structure, but depended on outcomes. This created cognitive dissonance. Dissonance does not immediately produce rebellion. It produces fatigue, and fatigue weakens coordination. As frustration grew, energy dispersed again. Collective awareness stalled. Uncontested power regained its insulation, but this phase revealed the truth. Inevitability is not absolute. It must be maintained. And maintenance requires constant sensing, continuous adjustment, and an unwillingness to engage on terms set by frustration. The strongest positions do not eliminate awareness. They exhaust it by letting questions circulate without resolution, by letting concern peak without outlet, by letting attention drift. The conflict did not end in collapse. It dissolved back into routine. But that dissolution came at a cost. The system had to tighten its grip quietly. Integration deepened, flexibility narrowed, and that narrowing set the stage for a final test, because the more uncontested power hardens, the more brittle it becomes. And brittleness, once exposed, cannot be ignored. The climax arrives when uncontested power proves it does not need to crush resistance, because by the time resistance fully recognizes itself, the system has already adapted in ways that make reversal impractical rather than forbidden. This is where inevitability becomes real. Power does not respond with force. It does not announce victory. It does not even acknowledge the challenge directly. It simply continues operating. Friction no longer feels like something to fight. It feels like something to endure. And endurance quietly replaces opposition. People stop imagining alternatives not because they were convinced, but because alternatives now carry unacceptable cost, uncertainty, and delay. This is the final mechanism. Uncontested power does not dominate by overwhelming dissent. It dominates by outlasting attention. As concern fades, routines return. As routines return, dependency deepens. As dependency deepens, challenge loses relevance. The sheiks understood that the strongest positions are not defended aggressively. They are normalized patiently. Once a system becomes a default reference point, even its flaws become accepted as conditions of reality rather than reasons for revolt. This is the resolution. Uncontested power does not need to win debates. It does not need to silence critics. It does not need to prove legitimacy. It only needs to remain present long enough for alternatives to feel unrealistic. At that stage, power stops feeling like power. It feels like environment, and environments are not opposed. They are navigated. That is why the strongest positions feel uncontested, not because they are perfect, but because they become too embedded to confront, without dismantling everything around them. Once power reaches this point, resistance does not disappear. It dissolves into adaptation. And adaptation, over time, is indistinguishable from acceptance. That is a quiet end to conflict, not with victory, not with defeat, but with normalization. Why